Welcome back to Indiana at the voice of college football. And we're on Purdue week, final week of the regular season. And nobody thought at the beginning of the year that Indiana was going to be in the college football playoff conversation. This was not expected to happen at all whatsoever. Indiana was expected to go 3-9 or 4-8, 5-7. I had them going 7-5. A few brave souls had them going at least 6-6. Maybe 7-5 like me, but nobody thought they were going to do any better than that. I surely didn't. I thought maybe I was too bullish having them going 7-5, but here we are. Indiana is at 10-1 in the college football playoff conversation, and one went away from making it. To me, it doesn't matter. With all the parity that's going on, especially in the SEC, with all of the SEC teams beating up on each other, now a lot of the teams like Alabama and Ole Miss and Texas A&M all have 3 losses, South Carolina, that's just putting those teams out of the picture. Even though I know some people are saying, oh, well, if Alabama beats Auburn, they could backdoor their way in at 9-3 because of their strength of schedule and their good wins. You never know. I mean, it's possible, but it really shouldn't happen. But it wouldn't surprise me if it did. But should those teams leapfrog a one-loss Indiana? I don't think so. Now, are those teams better than Indiana? See, that is where the conversation just comes from, because whether you're an SEC homer or whether you are just a unbiased college football fan that has the belief that the SEC is so superior to all the other conferences that those teams with 3 losses deserve to get in over a one-loss Big Ten team. The thing is, I'm not that far off from those people. I just differ on saying that a one-loss Big Ten team like Indiana should miss the playoff for a 3-loss SEC team. That's where I differ from those people, but I do understand that the SEC is by far the best conference. And when you go by far, I'm not talking about like this. It's like that. The SEC is here, then the Big Ten, and then everybody else is way underneath that, because we do know that the Big 12 and the ACC are just weak. They're weak conferences now. They're not strong at all, which is why it's hilarious that the argument about Indiana, they shouldn't get in the college football playoff because of their easy schedule and all that. But then Miami, who has had an even weaker schedule than Indiana and has a loss to a Georgia Tech team that is not ranked, whereas Indiana's loss is to the second or maybe even the best team in college football. That's where I don't understand it. But Miami being a brand, I still think it's more brand bias than anything else. I think it's more brand bias than it is, oh, well, Indiana's schedule's weak. But it is what it is. Those people are going to think what they think. But what matters is what the committee thinks. And they're going to rank Indiana in the college football playoff ranking soon. I don't know where they're going to be. They're probably going to be 10th in my opinion, because they are 10th in the AP and the coaches poll. And the CFP rankings and the AP rankings have actually surprisingly been pretty close. A lot of years they've actually differed a lot in their rankings. Not this year. They have been very close on ranking the same way with the AP and the CFP rankings. They have not been that far off. So I think Indiana's still going to be in the top 12. They're going to be in the playoff projected field as of now, because talking real quick about the Ohio State game, I did a post-game recap on Saturday night if you want to go check that out on my complete thoughts on the game. But Indiana did not lose by as much as the score would indicate. And so if the committee actually is doing their jobs that they're supposed to do and watch these games, then they would realize that Indiana did not get destroyed like the score would indicate. If they didn't watch the game and all they see is this, they see 38-15, then they're like, okay, well, Indiana got destroyed. They don't deserve to be in. I still don't understand, though, how that's okay for Georgia, though, to lose by 17 to Ole Miss on the road. But they're fine. Georgia's still in the playoff field. Nobody's saying otherwise. We get it. Georgia's got talent. They're in the SEC. They play in a tougher schedule. All that's true. But Georgia still lost by 17 on the road. Just like Alabama just lost 24-3 to Oklahoma. They lost by 21 on the road to an unranked team, but Alabama should still get it. Again, I don't understand that. I'm an Alabama fan. People know that I'm an Indiana fan and an Alabama fan. I still don't understand that, though. That's messed up. Alabama lost to an unranked team on the road by 21. They're still, in a lot of people's opinions, should still make the playoff. Whereas Indiana loses by 23 to Ohio State on the road, and suddenly the second best team in the country, and now they should be out. Illinois? Why is Miami still in the field with a loss to Georgia Tech? Those are brands. That's why. It just doesn't make any sense. That's insane. It really is. I mean, even SMU, their schedule's weak, but SMU should be in if they went out. If Indiana wins against Purdue, they should be in the college football playoff. That's why, because I had a segment on this last week. Will an 11-1 Indiana make the CFP? Because we were all expecting Indiana to lose to Ohio State. I was expecting them to lose to Ohio State. I picked Ohio State. All the other games this year, I picked Indiana to win. I even picked them against Michigan. I was very close on thinking about maybe picking Michigan, but I didn't because they don't have a quarterback. But when it came to Ohio State, I'm like, Ohio State's a better team. They are the better team, and they're at home. That crowd's going to be insane, and it was. Credit to the Buckeye fans and their insane environment in the shoe. It was one of the loudest environments all season long because Ohio State knew that Indiana was a threat because they were in the top 5 and they couldn't overlook them. And boy, did they not. But still, looking at the way the game went, there was like 3 plays, as I said on Saturday night, that really impacted the score. There was a late touchdown Ohio State scored at the end. Could have kneeled the ball out, but they kept playing. That's fine. A lot of teams do that. Indiana's even done that this year. They didn't act like they were going to kneel and then score, but still. Teams have scored late in games right at the end to pad the score out. That's fine. So Ohio State does that. It would have been 31-15 if Ohio State didn't score. And then again, you had a muff punt. That was all on Indiana. The crowd got to them probably. And again, that's credit to Ohio State's crowd. And there are 105,000 fans. And then you also had a return touchdown that Ohio State had that there was a hold. And yes, there were a couple of plays that Ohio State would have had that would have been very beneficial that they didn't have because of missed calls that Indiana held. There was a couple of those. But still, when you look at the game and you look at the yards that were gained by both teams and the fact that Indiana was able to run the ball on Ohio State, they couldn't pass much because the O-line's a little banged up. Ohio State's D-line is one of the best in the country. They impacted Indiana's O-line, but Indiana was able to run the ball, and Ohio State didn't really run the playoff with a 21-point loss on the road to Oklahoma. And if Georgia's still in contention for the playoff with a 17-point loss to Ole Miss, or an 18-point loss to Ole Miss on the road, that you can't say Indiana's not going to get in as long as they beat Purdue. Now, if they lose to Purdue, then they absolutely should be eliminated, and they will be. But I just don't agree. I don't agree at all. But it doesn't matter. What matters is what the committee does, and we'll see what they do. But I think Indiana still will be ranked in the top 10. Probably at number 10, maybe at number 9, but I think they'll be at number 10. All the parity helped. I'm not going to lie. I mean, if Ole Miss won and Alabama won and Texas A&M won last week, then yeah, Indiana probably falls to like 13 and then beat Purdue and then hope chaos happens and maybe they can sneak in. But with all those losses, I mean, people are going to be frustrated. Now, the SEC homers, and the thing is, like, I'm a fan of Alabama. I'm a fan of the Crimson Tide. I'm still not a homer. I just watch football. I don't disagree that the SEC is not the best league, but if you lose your games, you don't get in. That's how this works. That's why they put the 12-team playoff to make teams from other leagues have a chance to get in. It's not the SEC Invitational. If you want to make it the SEC Invitational, then just make it the SEC Invitational and have all the top SEC teams get into a 12-team playoff and then let all the other conferences duke it out in another playoff. That's what you should do. If you're going to put Alabama, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, all these teams in with 3 losses into the playoff anyway, it doesn't make sense. Now, obviously, in A&M's case, with their 3 losses, they could still win out, get into the playoff. They'll get into the playoff if they win out because they have Texas in the final game of the regular season. If they win that game, then they would make the SEC title game, and if they win that, then they would get in. But other than A&M, no other SEC team still has a chance with 3 losses based off the fact that they can't win the SEC. And those are the rules. I mean, if Indiana loses again, if Miami loses again, if some of these teams lose again, and there's 2-loss teams against a 3-loss Bama, yeah, I would probably put Alabama in over a 2-loss Indiana. I probably would. Even though I still think it's a bit unfair if you have more losses that you leapfrog. But yeah, I would put Alabama over Indiana in that scenario. But a 1-loss Indiana and a 3-loss Alabama, you got to put in the 1-loss Indiana. Otherwise, why are we playing the games? It doesn't make sense to play the games. It doesn't at all. If you're going to do that, you should just automatically say, well, Alabama's getting into the CFP regardless. It doesn't matter. Whatever. How they could lose to Auburn, they could still get in. I mean, no, they wouldn't, but still, the 12-team playoff, It's being tilted toward the SEC still heavily, which we knew it was going to happen. I knew when they did it. That's why, honestly, it would have just been better for them to keep the 14 playoff, and Indiana wouldn't even be in the conversation right now. Neither would Alabama. They're done. See, this wasn't ever a problem for Alabama when Saban was the coach. When Nick Saban was the coach, they would just always make the playoff. No big deal. They would always make the playoff. It wasn't a problem. They missed it once, or maybe I think it was just once. So maybe twice. But other than that, like, they just kept making the playoff every year with Saban. It was no big deal. But now it's a 12-team playoff, and Alabama's on the outside looking in. They're not comfortably in because they've lost 3 games. They never lost 3 games under Saban once Nick Saban built up the dynasty. Never lost more than 2. They had the 7-6 season in 2007. That was his first year. But once he got Alabama rolling, they just kept winning. It wasn't a big issue at all. They just kept winning, and they would make the playoff every year. And people would argue whether they deserved to be in with 1 loss. And yes, Alabama deserved to be in with 1 loss. Alabama has 2 losses to teams that are 6-5 in Oklahoma and Vanderbilt. It just doesn't scream playoff to me. I get the Bama name. I understand their strength of schedule and all that. But if you're going to put Alabama in, then over in Indiana, then you might as well just make it the SEC Invitational, and that's just not how it should be. As long as the current format still allows all these other conferences to make the playoff, even though Alabama is a better football team than Indiana, I will stress that. They are a better football team because they got oodles of talent. They got 5 stars all over the field. Indiana doesn't. But Indiana, if they go 11-1, should make the college football playoff. It should not be a discussion. If they were in an inferior league, it'd be different if they were in, like, the MAC. But they're not. They're in the Big Ten. They're in the Big Ten. They should get into the playoff if that happens. Now, changing the subject, though, we do have to talk about Indiana increases pay for assistants. This is big. This is big news for Indiana because of the fact a lot of people are talking about the fact that, oh, well, Indiana is not committed to football. And they're right. Indiana has never been committed to football. That's never been their MO. It's always been basketball and nothing else. But Scott Dolson, Pam Whitten, all the leaders at Indiana University realize that if Indiana wants to be still in the Big Ten and not get kicked out, they're going to have to show a commitment to football because that's what all these schools are doing that wants to be serious in the NCAA, where football makes up 90% of the revenue, basketball makes up like 5%, and then all of the other sports that you might have make up the other 5%. Lacrosse, field hockey, water polo, they're great sports. It's awesome for people that they get to play those sports. Do whatever, you're passionate and you're good at. But those sports don't make anything. Half those sports are never on TV. And if they are on TV, it's for like the championship game. And fan interest, the stadiums are small. Even baseball, America's sport and pastime for 100 years until the last 20, 30 years, doesn't make nowhere near the money as football and basketball. And even basketball is still a fraction. The NBA makes a ton in jersey sales and stuff, but still, like, the NFL and college football make the most. But college football makes the most for the NCAA by far. So if your university wants to be, a legit contender for anything, in your conference, you have, especially when it comes to money, you have to be committed to football and you have to win and have success in football. And Indiana finally is realizing that. And they gave Curt Cignetti the big contract extension, which I said was going to happen. I knew that he was going to get extended. Now, a lot of people are saying he was going to leave for another job. Well, if he does leave for another job one day, it is what it is. But it wasn't going to be after this season. He's staying at IU for a while, in my opinion. He's staying in Indiana for a while. He's basically said that he is. If he's not, then he's just not telling the truth. Some coaches can do that. We saw Lincoln Riley kind of divert when it looked like he was going like maybe to LSU, then he went to USC. It didn't stay at Oklahoma at all. It can happen. But I think Cignetti's telling the truth here. Got no basis for that, but he's basically said again and again, as long as Indiana shows a commitment to football, he's going to stay. Well, this is it. Indiana not only extending Curt Cignetti and saying that they're going to do stadium improvements, they're also giving $11 million assistant salary pool for all the assistants. $11 million to be spread out among all the assistant coaches. That's the offensive coordinator, the defensive coordinator, the quarterback's coach, the tight ends coach, the defensive line coach, safeties coach, special teams coach, all the coaches. All that money, that $11 million that you see on screen, is going to be going towards all those assistants. And when you look at Ohio State, is $11.43 million. The highest in the nation. And Indiana is right behind that. Why is that happening? Because if Indiana is going to continue to win, because I've had debates with people about this all year, and they are absolutely correct. Is it all on Curt Cignetti? No, it's not. Those people are absolutely right when they say it's not all Curt Cignetti. It is the assistants as well. We saw with Tom Allen the 2 good years that he had a good QB in Michael Penix, and he also had great assistant coaches in Kalen DeBoer and Kane Womack. That's why Indiana won games. They lost those assistant coaches, and then Indiana fell into the floor. Didn't matter that you still had Michael Penix. Indiana didn't win anything. So Indiana is having a lot of success this season, not only because of Curt Cignetti, but also because of the assistant coaches. How do you keep those assistant coaches, especially when we're already seeing some of those coaches be listed as, names for coaching searches, like the ECU job and the Temple job? It's already been floated around that, Bryant Haynes, the defensive coordinator for Indiana, who's done really good this year, could go to one of those schools. So ECU already filled their spot. Temple, they might have. I can't remember if Temple got their coach yet. But regardless, if you want Bryant Haynes and Tino Sunseri and some of the other assistant coaches and Mike Shanahan at Indiana to remain at Indiana for at least a few years, you got to pay them more. That's why you look at Clemson. Dabo Swinney was paying Brent Venables so much money. And yeah, Brent Venables eventually took the Oklahoma head coaching job, but he stayed at Clemson a lot longer than anybody was ever expecting him to stay at Clemson, because Clemson just kept paying him more and more money. He was making like $3 million a year. Could be wrong. Could have been more than that, but he was making almost $3 million a year just as the defensive coordinator. He was like the highest paid coordinator in the nation. And why did he stay that long? Because Clemson kept paying him more. If he was only being paid like $1 million a year, he would have bolted for a head coaching job a lot sooner than that. So you want to keep assistant coaches for a long time, you got to pay them. And Indiana is showing commitment to football even further than just paying Cignetti. That's what they did with Tom Allen. They paid Tom Allen that big extension. They didn't pay any of the assistants, so they all left. Well, with Cignetti, he's like, they're showing commitment by the stadium renovations that they're about to do. They're showing, commitment by they're going to make the practice facilities better, the weight room better, all that kind of stuff that players care about as well when they go on visits. It's the place falling apart. Indiana back 10 years ago had terrible facilities. They're getting a lot better. And now you're paying the assistant coaches more. Eventually, you're going to lose these guys. That's the inevitable. Like with Brent Venables leaving, you're eventually going to lose these guys. You're not going to keep them forever. Even if Cignetti stays in Indiana for a decade, eventually, as long as these assistant coaches still do a great job and their numbers are great, and Indiana's among the best teams in college football on offense and defense, you're eventually going to lose these guys. They're eventually going to go to other teams anyway. But you're able to keep them around longer when you pay them. And people are going to leave a job and go to another job that pays more if you don't up your money. That's just the way that it works. Anybody would do that, even in regular work. That's the way that it works. You're going to leave for a different job that pays more. You would be insane not to, especially if the job is better. And in college football terms, going from an assistant coach to a head coach, it's a better job. That's what all coaches want to do, unless you're content to be an assistant, but most aren't. You get into that field to become a head coach. So, great news for IU. I was very happy to see this, because if Indiana is competing with Ohio State financially for assistant coaches, and they're competing financially with the amount they're paying Cignetti, and they're going to do these stadium renovations, and all this NIL that's being pumped into the program, that just means that Indiana is going to continue to do good, in my opinion. Are they going to be as good as they were this year? Probably not, because the schedule is probably going to be harder in future years. I've looked at the schedule already for next year. It's not the easiest in the world, especially if the teams remain as good as they are this year, right? When you look ahead to future schedules, all you're doing is comparing the way the team is playing now to next year. If you're going off last year, Indiana's schedule this year would have been one of the toughest in the nation, because they had Michigan and Washington on the schedule. Well, guess what? Michigan and Washington ended up being a whole lot worse this year. That helped Indiana. So next year, Indiana has to go on the road at Penn State, has to go on the road at Oregon. Well, what if next year Penn State and Oregon aren't as good? That could help Indiana. You never know how these teams are going to play until the season gets going. So coming into this season, Indiana was supposed to have a tough schedule. Not the hardest in the world. It wasn't as hard as it's been in years past, but it's still supposed to be tough. But Indiana's opponents, they didn't do as good this year. It's the way it worked. So, yeah, great news for IU overall that they're showing commitment to football. I love to see it. I love to see it. It's great news because now that I know that Indiana is committed to football, it means Cignetti's going to stay longer. It means his assistants are going to stay longer. It means they're going to get better football players because of the fact they've already done a great job in recruiting. But with these guys staying, those recruits know that they're going to stay for a few years, and they know Cignetti's not going anywhere. It's going to make them more these guys and that they're going to have success in the future. So you love to see it. But we got to talk about Purdue. Indiana, Purdue, the old Oaken Bucket. We got to preview that game because of the fact when you're talking about Indiana's college football playoff chances and you're talking about this season, nobody was expecting them to go 10-1 with their only loss being to Ohio State. But now that Indiana is 10-1 and all they have to do is beat Purdue to basically get into the playoff no matter what, unless the unthinkable happens and they get left out, which would be insane. All they got to do is win this game. They're in the college football playoff. And what makes this even crazier is not only is Indiana 10-1 and ranked in the top 10, Purdue is awful. Purdue is terrible this year. They are awful. They're 1-10. I would have never thought Purdue would have been 1-10 this year. I knew they were going to be bad. I knew Purdue was going to be bad, but I know they were going to be this bad. I thought they were going to at least win 3 or 4 games. I think I had them going 3-9, actually, if I recall. Don't quote me on that because you'd have to go back and see my predictions at the beginning of the season. I think I said 3-9. I might have said 4-8, but I think I said 3-9. Purdue's been even worse than anybody could have imagined. Ron Walters, the fact that he's still employed is insane. I would have thought he'd been fired. There's been some allegations that may or may not be true against him as well. I don't, usually ever really dig that much into allegations unless I know they're true. So take that with a grain of salt. But regardless, still surprised he hasn't been fired. Last time Purdue was really bad was when they had Harrell at coach, Graham Harrell, and he was bad. And Purdue got rid of him pretty quickly. I think after 3 years. Now, granted, Ron Walters is only in year 2, but honestly, how can anybody who is a Purdue fan look at this team and think, oh, yeah, we're going to be better next year. We're going to be a better football team next year. I know that you can use the portal. I know that you can use the portal kind of like Indiana. Indiana used the portal, went from 3-9 last year, now 10-1. But that's a unique situation. Got a new head coach in Cignetti. And they also brought in a lot of guys that Cignetti was familiar with, James Madison. They did bring in a few other guys as well, but the key point remains that Indiana and, with Curt Cignetti, it was a new coach, bringing in a lot of new players. You didn't know how it was going to go. And this was the absolute best scenario that Indiana could have gotten. Nobody thought they were going to be this good. With Purdue, though, it's already been 2 years. So he was recruiting the first year in the portal. He's recruited this year. He brought in Hudson Card at quarterback. Hudson Card's at quarterback, the transfer from Texas, and that hasn't worked out very well. Now, I don't think Hudson Card's bad. I don't think he's a terrible player, but I do think that the O-line's terrible. They don't have the receivers that Jeff Brom had. I mean, when Jeff Brom was at Purdue, you had the Rondell Moores, you had the David Bells, you had guys. I mean, every year Indiana played Purdue, there was just that one receiver Purdue had that would just light them up. Purdue doesn't have that. They have no good receivers, basically. They don't have none of those really solid players that they had 3 or 4 years ago. They even had that receiver that they got from Iowa, that transfer receiver. He was good as well. That's in the NFL and doing very good. So, yeah, I mean, overall, Purdue's just lifeless on offense. Their defense stinks, too. I mean, they've been giving up a ton of points. The only thing that I'm honestly worried about in this game at all is just, does Indiana let that Ohio State loss get to them? Do they still sulk over that loss and lose here? I mean, because people are going to be like, well, how can Indiana lose this game? I mean, we've seen a lot of football this year. There's been a ton of teams that were heavily favored that have lost. And not even among the power teams. Seen like Liberty. Liberty lost, and I forgot who they played. It was like Southern Miss. It was somebody really bad. Liberty was a 28-point favorite. All I know is that. They were favored by 28 points. It was either like Kennesaw State or Southern Miss. It was a yellow team. But they lost that game, and they were favored by 28. You know how much Indiana's favored by in this game? 28. So even though Indiana's favored by 28, and I'm telling you that Purdue is really, really bad, it does not mean that Indiana can't lose. They could lose if they play terrible. Alabama was favored to beat Oklahoma by 2 touchdowns. They lost by 21. That's a 35-point swing. So if Purdue wins this game by 7 over Indiana, that's a 35-point swing, the exact same as Alabama. It is possible. I'm not going to go on this show and say Indiana, there's no chance that they're gonna lose. Now, I'm not saying that. You know why? Because there's always a chance that your team can lose. Always a chance. I feel like if this season doesn't prove it to people, then no season's ever going to prove it to people. You can't take any game for granted. Now, we as fans, like me, I look at this game and I'm like, if I was like the Indiana spokesperson or whatever before the game, I'd be like, don't overlook Purdue. You give it your all. Play as hard as you did against Nebraska. Play as hard as you did against Michigan State, where you blew out those teams. And Indiana will be fine, but we're fans. And even media people don't influence games. They don't. So you can be, as a fan, like, oh, I'm worried about this game. Don't overlook this opponent. Don't overlook that last roadblock that will prevent you from making the CFP. That's going to be Cignetti's job to tell the players. Don't overlook this team. Play hard. It's your rivals. You get that bucket back. I mean, there's a lot of motivation here. But there was a lot of motivation for Alabama to go on the road at Oklahoma if they wanted to stay in the playoff race, and they didn't do that either. So we as fans and media members and even the coach can be nervous and, like, don't overlook this team. But that doesn't mean it's going to register to the players. Sometimes it doesn't register to the players. And sometimes a team just plays really bad. And everybody vouching for Georgia, saying they should be in the playoff and all that. And they're in the playoff field right now. They beat Kentucky by 1. Kentucky's bad. They beat Mississippi State by 10. They're bad. So Georgia can play poor too. They just found ways to win those games. But so if Indiana barely wins this game, then a lot of people are going to say, oh, they don't deserve to be in either. Well, if that's the case, then why does Georgia get a pass for beating Kentucky by 1? Again, these things are not fair to assess because every single team this season has had poor games. Oregon barely beat Wisconsin. Or Oregon looked like garbage against Wisconsin. That's a trap game. Like, Oregon's got all their tough games out of the way. They've already beaten Ohio State. They've already beaten some other big teams in the Big Ten. All they got to do is win out. They're going to get the number 1 seed. They're all good. Well, guess what? You got a little trap game at Wisconsin. They didn't play well. Didn't take them seriously. So they almost lost. They won. Wins the win. So for Indiana, yeah, it would look a lot better if they blow out Purdue, because then that would validate that they're good to the CFP, committee voters. But still, at the same time, it's like Indiana could struggle in this game. It's just natural. It's natural for players, especially the way we've seen this season with teams where you have letdown games. And Indiana's coming off a tragic loss, a loss that this is their first loss of the year. So they should win this game by a lot. It should. I'm not predicting it just yet, but they should win this game by a lot. It should not be a close game. But based off the way Indiana plays, if they play poor, it could be close. And especially if Purdue shows any life. Purdue's got nothing to play for except to spoil Indiana's season. That's all they got. So Purdue might give it their all. And if Indiana lets them hang around, you never know. Now, I will say one note on this game. It is the first night game in the old Oak and Buckets history, which is hilarious because most of Indiana's and Purdue's games have always been at noon or 3:30. This and it's on FS1 at 7 o'clock. So that's going to be great for IU. Their first night game of the year at home. That's cool. And sold out crowd as well. And it, just because it's sold out doesn't mean that all the fans are going to show up. If you're an Indiana fan and you do not show up to this game, if you bought a ticket, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. You got to show up to this game. All right, like Indiana's having an historic season. It's their first 10-win season ever. You beat the national champions last year. You beat the runner-up last year. You're having an historic season. Don't let that loss to Ohio State be like, oh, well, we're not going to show up to this game. Come on, if you bought tickets, if you're one of the people that bought the tickets, that's a part of the sellout, you got to show up. Please show up to this game. Make it as hard on Purdue as possible. But to predict this game, looking real quick at Purdue, Hudson Card, the quarterback for Purdue, only 58% completion percentage, 9 touchdowns, 6 picks. It's been pretty ugly. The backup, Ron Brown, not too much better, 513 yards, 4 touchdowns, and a pick. But again, in these guys' defense, they just don't have a great offensive line, don't have a lot of weapons. Devin Mockabee, he's a solid player overall. I mean, 124 carries. That dreaded numbers with the 3 6s that people don't like. At how many yards he has this year, 4 touchdowns. I mean, he's a pretty good back. But again, not a lot of support for him. He doesn't really have anybody else other than Reggie Love, the Illinois transfer. Just not a whole lot there. Then receiving, their best receivers, a tight end, Max Clare, having a good season. And the receivers just are not very impactful. And on defense, I mean, they got guys with a lot of tackles, but that's because they're trying to stop people. It's not really that their defense is good. Their defense, it ranks as one of the worst in college football. It's pretty bad. Then looking at Indiana, again, Curtis Rourke, what else can be said about his season? I know last couple of games he hasn't had the statistics to really back up his Heisman contending season. He's out of the Heisman race now. He's not going to have any shot to win it. He probably wouldn't have anyway, even if he had a great game against Ohio State because of Travis Hunter, Genty, Cam Ward, and Dylan Gabriel. But Rourke was great all season long. But see, now you're going up against Purdue that has no pass rush. So Rourke should be able to go off in this game. When he's protected, he can go off. We saw it against Nebraska, saw it against Michigan State, some of the other teams that they've played. But when he's pressured, he can struggle. But when he has time, he's really, really good. And then Indiana's running backs. If they can run it on Ohio State, they should be able to run on Purdue. I mean, if they can't run the ball on Purdue, then that's a problem. I mean, they ran the ball very well against Ohio State. It was a great D-line. So I'm expecting Justice Ellison, Tyson Walton to have big games. Elijah Surratt, he struggled the last couple games, but the opponent's a lot worse. I think that's going to help him. He's got a great supporting cast. And then defense, Indiana actually does have a good defense. And they hung with Ohio State. Ironically, the only side of the ball on offense, or the only part of the ball on offense that was good in that game was the running game for Indiana. On defense, I thought the whole defense played pretty well. The D-line was pretty good. They didn't allow Ohio State to run that much. Ohio State ran for a whole lot less than Indiana did. Indiana's secondary did great. Jeremiah Smith has had a great year. The freshman for Ohio State only had 34 receiving yards. That's all he had in the game. Indiana limited him to 34 receiving yards. Now, Emeka Egbuka had a better game, but Indiana was not going to let Jeremiah Smith win out. Purdue doesn't have any big weapons. So all I know is that, to me, looking at this game, Indiana is by far the superior team. And as long as they're focused, and as long as they don't overlook Purdue, or they're not still sulking off the Ohio State loss, they should win. It should not be close. I'm going to predict this game to be 34-14. I think Indiana wins fairly easily. I would have predicted an even bigger win, but I think Indiana is going to start out a little sluggish. I do. I think they're going to start out a little sluggish, but by the end of the game, kind of like against, like Northwestern, where it was kind of close and then they pulled away, I think Indiana is going to pull away. I think Purdue's going to keep it close early because Indiana might still be sulking a little bit, might still be a little upset about that game against Ohio State. And then they're going to get it together. Curt Cignetti's going to light a fire under them at halftime, and Indiana's going to pull away. And there's not going to really be a whole lot Purdue can do to stop Indiana's offense. When Indiana's gone up against inferior opponents, the type of opponents that people have mocked Indiana for facing this season, Indiana does great. Their offense, when they're playing poor defenses, goes off. And Purdue has a poor defense. I think Indiana is going to be just fine. As long as Indiana wins this game by the score I say, 34-14 or anywhere in that ballpark, they will be in the college football playoff. And they're going to get that old Oaken bucket back from the Purdue Boilermakers, who've had it now for 5 years. Way too long. Indiana looking to put an end to that. But appreciate everybody for being here tonight. We had Jeff in the house tonight. Appreciate it. We got Troy V saying, I think brand bias, why we all say the SEC superior conference. Maybe in previous year, I've seen some very mid games play. Yeah, absolutely. Troy, you're 100% correct. Georgia, Alabama, they've all had horrible games against teams that are not that good, which is hilarious. I mean, yeah, they play tougher schedules, but in years past, you didn't see the Georgias and Bamas losing to teams like, Vandy and Ole Miss by 18 points. You didn't see that. Or Ole Miss losing to Kentucky, or Georgia beating Kentucky by 1. You didn't see that. Seeing it this year. So I agree, Troy. You're absolutely right. Thanks for stopping by. We got Sports Talk with Austin here tonight. Jeff saying happy Thanksgiving to everybody. We got Buckeye Mike here as well saying Indiana will make the CFP at 11-1. Absolutely. And the chaos helped. I'm not going to lie. The chaos did help with all the SEC teams losing. 100%. Yeah, the 80-yard punt return touchdown on downs broke the game. 100%. And there was a hold on that return, but it is what it is. They didn't call it. But yeah, when Down scored, it was over. Troy V saying happy Thanksgiving. Mike says SC homers can miss me with Bama even 3 losses. There to be over IU 11-1. Yeah, I mean that should not be an argument. Jim R says early season matters also. Otherwise, just count the last 6. Yeah, I mean, the thing that's funny to me, though, is that when you talk about Notre Dame losing Northern Illinois, people say, oh, it was at the beginning of the season. But then you go the opposite route and you say, well, oh, Miami beat a average Florida team on the road by 20-something points, and then Indiana barely beats Michigan by 5 at home. That shows you Miami is better than Indiana. And it's like, okay, well, Miami beat Florida at the beginning of the season by that much. You think Miami would beat Florida by that much now? No, they probably wouldn't, because you know why? You got Lagway now. Florida's got Lagway. If Indiana played Michigan earlier in the season, Indiana probably wins by more. But Michigan's gotten their stuff together. Michigan's playing better. They figured out the quarterback situation. Davis Warren's not good, but he's better than Orgy, and he's better than Jack Tuttle, who retired. So Michigan got better. And Florida's gotten better since then, because Graham Mertz played against Miami, got floored. But Georgia, I think, honestly, again, and I wish it had happened. I wish it had happened, especially for Austin's 8-4 Florida prediction to come true, and for people saying Georgia's so great, they'd have been out of the playoff hunt too. Florida was destroying Georgia until Lagway went down with that injury. Florida's been great last couple weeks. They've been really good. And Napier's job safe. Well, all the calls for Napier's head and his job, fine now. He's all good. But yeah, that's why it's not fair, when you're comparing early season results to later. Oh, well, they don't matter. But then in some cases they do to fit a narrative. It's garbage, honestly. It really is. If you're going to use the same narratives, they got to be consistent all the way across the board. We got Jackson here tonight as well saying Happy Thanksgiving. Appreciate that, Jackson. Jack says if Indiana was in the ACC, I agree, 100%. If they were in the ACC, then Indiana would probably not be in. Even though Miami is right now with one loss to an inferior Georgia Tech team and a couple of really bad wins over Virginia Tech and Cal, where they should have lost both games, but it's Miami. They're a brand. Indiana, they would probably not in if they were in the ACC, but they're in the Big Ten. It's completely different. Choices, I wouldn't say that, Jabber. I'd change it to if Milroe's on his game. Yeah, if Milroe's on his game, Alabama's a better team than Indiana. And when Milroe is off, Alabama's still a better team than Indiana because they have more talent. The problem is, though, is when Alabama plays like they did against Oklahoma, Indiana could beat them, absolutely, to your point. Yes, if Milroe has a garbage game with 3 picks, Indiana can win. But regardless if Indiana wins or not, Alabama's still the better football team. They got better players. Just like if Indiana had have knocked off Ohio State last week, Ohio State's still the better football team. That's why people get confused when I say that. The better team does not always win. I still think Michigan is a better football team than Indiana this year. Indiana, only reason why that they're better and they've won more games than Michigan is because part of it's a little bit easier schedule, but the other reason is that Indiana had a quarterback. Michigan did not. Michigan has no quarterback. If they had a quarterback, then they would have been good, because the rest of their team's pretty good. I mean, they have a couple of holes, but overall, they're still a very talented team. But I agree, Troy. I mean, if Milroe's off, Indiana could win, which is why it's funny when people say Indiana couldn't beat Alabama. Yes, they could if Alabama played like they did last week. If Alabama plays the way they did against LSU, Indiana's got no chance. It's over. Alabama's just been very in the playoff. If Alabama still somehow squeaks in the playoff, I think the motivation is going to be there. I still don't know why the motivation wasn't there against Oklahoma, though. Jim Arson with 12 are already trying to justify cold poor performances to get a team in the playoffs. I don't know. Yeah, it just makes the whole expansion dumb, honestly, because all they're going to do is let's expand it to 16 or 24. So now you're going to be debating whether the 8-4 Florida should get in over 10-2 SMU. It's the same arguments. All you're doing if you expand the playoff is creating more arguments about who should get in and who doesn't. It doesn't make sense. It honestly doesn't make sense. Don't expand it anymore, because all you're doing is going to be adding more teams that don't deserve to get in. Leave it at 12, but they're probably not. Absolutely. We also got Leo here as well. Appreciate it. Says, yeah, they aren't going to these schools any longer. The name, money, talk. Yeah, it's all about money. And, a team like Georgia getting in or Alabama makes more than Indiana. It is what it is. If you don't ever let Indiana have a shot to build anything, then they're never going to be able to compete in the brand department. That's what doesn't make sense. Jack says, as soon as the Memphis Michigan State game is over, we'll find out where Indiana will be ranked. Yeah, hopefully they're ranked at least 9 or 10. I'm hoping so. Jackson saying to tell the cashiers of Publix about the Magic, Jeffrey, and I make on Alabama Collins Show, and also here at Indiana, the Voice of College Football. Appreciate that, Jackson, a lot. 11 million says IU's competitive. Absolutely, says Jen. Absolutely. Yeah, you got to keep them happy. I mean, if you don't pay your assistants, they're going to leave. Yeah, that's what people have said. Indiana's got the donor pool. They got tons of money. So, yeah, people are saying that Indiana can't compete. All Indiana had to do was back in the 1920s say, we're going to get Newt Rockne, not let Notre Dame have it. If they had done that, Indiana would have been good. They didn't do it. But then all Indiana had to do was pay Bo McMillan, prevent him from going to the NFL. Didn't do that either. So Bo McMillan left. Then Indiana, just kept stinking and not having any good coaches and hiring all these terrible coaches and not showing commitment to football. Now they finally are. It makes a big difference when you try to win and try to compete. Indiana has the money. They just never put it towards it. Letter B says IU at Penn State or IU at Notre Dame would be fun. Yeah, and Indiana would have a shot in both games. People saying that they wouldn't. I mean, I think they'd have a better shot if they were at home, but if they're still on the road, I think they could hang with Notre Dame or Penn State. But it still depends on the way Penn State and Notre Dame plays. If Penn State plays the way that they did against, Illinois or something like that, maybe. But if Penn State plays the way they did in some of their better games, then probably not. Notre Dame plays like they did against Northern Illinois, Indiana could beat them. But if they play the way that they did in some of their big wins this year, then it wouldn't be close. That's the way it would work for me. I mean, Indiana will have a shot against both teams on the road, but it would have to come down to how those other teams play too. Jim says, regardless, you have to reward the team that earned it by winning. Absolutely. Absolutely. If you're not going to reward the teams for winning the games, then what's the point of playing the games? It's no point. If an 11-1 Indiana does not get in the playoff over a 3-loss SEC team, then there's really no point in playing the games, and it's just the SEC Invitational, and that to me would just be absolutely wrong. But appreciate everybody for being here tonight. Like the stream down below. Subscribe to the Indiana channel at the Voice of College Football if you are new. If you're enjoying the show, we're going to have more shows in the future week by week. We're also, doing post-game shows as well on Saturday nights when the games are over. So it's going to be a lot of fun in the future. Definitely excited to see. Hopefully Indiana takes back that bucket, goes 11-1, and will make the college football playoffs. It's going to be a lot of fun, and definitely do appreciate you guys for being here tonight. It's been a fantastic show. And before we head out of here, definitely a word from the sponsor at the Voice of College Football.
College football is even more exciting with some action on the line. And the games are even better when you're cashing in. And the Voice of College Football is the place to be to get the greatest value. Let's start with my picks. 75% against the money line, 58% against the spread. I've got a 40-year track record. In fact, in 2023, at $100 played per game, you would have netted over $9,300. And guess what? I'm just the warm-up act. Steve Merrill, our ace in the hole, show stopper from Wager Talk. 6 years with the Voice of College Football, over 30 years in the industry. Steve gives us analysis on all the big games, but you can't miss Steve's weekly under-the-radar pick, which went 21-5 against the spread the last 2 seasons. I repeat, 21-5 against the spread. You also get picks from some of our top analysts here at the Voice of College Football, including Steve Dace and Matt Zemek. Become a YouTube channel member or Patreon member for just $99 per month. Go to the main channel on YouTube, click join, and select the betting tier. Do the same thing on Patreon. Make 2024 a winner now.
Letter B says, would be hilarious to beat Tom Allen's defense at Happy Valley. And this says I'm being defeated. So I'm not trying to be. It was definitely a changing of opinion type of loss against Ohio State. The way they lost, I mean, they still fought and played well. I think Indiana could beat Penn State, Notre Dame on the road. Definitely think that they could, but definitely have to play better than they played against Ohio State. Clean up the mistakes, don't have the muff punt, and the refs can't be calling all these holds on IU and not calling them on the other team. Got to have refs be consistent. And Indiana's got to play more like they showed earlier in the season with the confident performance against Nebraska, Michigan State. And then I think that they could be able to win. It would be great, like you said, to beat Tom Allen's defense. That would be epic. But we'll have to see where the committee ranks them. Definitely going to be exciting to see what happens. And hopefully Indiana beats Purdue and goes 11-1 and makes the playoffs. Thanks for being everybody. And go